Right now, if you stripped away every piece of modern gear and dropped yourself into Central Europe around 20,000 years ago, you'd be facing temperatures that regularly fell to minus 20 or minus 30 degrees Celsius. No insulated jacket, no heated shelter, no grocery store within 100 miles. Most modern people wouldn't last a week. Ancient humans, with no technology beyond what they could make with their hands, survived that environment for generation after generation. Not just barely survived, but thrived enough to raise children, create art, and spread across the coldest parts of the planet. So how did they actually do it? The first thing to understand is how extreme the cold actually was. We're talking about the last glacial maximum, which peaked around 20,000 years ago, and locked much of the northern hemisphere under ice or open tundra. Britain was connected to mainland Europe by a frozen plain. The Sahara was cold and dry rather than hot and dry. In Siberia, summer was brief and unreliable, and winter just went on and on. Humans were living through all of this, not retreating from it, not hiding from it, but actively pushing deeper into some of the harshest landscapes on Earth, following herds of animals into places where survival required getting almost everything right. Fire is the obvious starting point, and it genuinely deserves to be. The earliest strong evidence of controlled fire use goes back roughly 400,000 years at a site called Qesem Cave in Israel. By the time the Ice Age peaked, fire wasn't just a tool for warmth. It was the center of everything. Cooking food made calories easier to absorb. Smoke kept predators away. Firelight extended the usable hours of the day in a season where sunlight barely lasted 6 hours. Ash and charcoal from ancient hearths show up at nearly every major winter habitation site we've found. And those hearths are often positioned deliberately, centered inside a shelter, or near the entrance to break the wind before it reached the people sleeping inside. Shelter was the next layer. Caves get most of the attention because stone preserves so well, but caves weren't always available and weren't always the first choice. At a site called Mezirik in Ukraine, archaeologists found structures built almost entirely from mammoth bones. Hundreds of individual pieces, jawbones stacked as walls, long limb bones used as structural supports, and the whole frame was likely covered in hides. These structures date to around 15,000 years ago. Building something like that required planning ahead. It required knowing what materials were available, where to find them, and how to put them together in a way that would hold against wind and snow. That's not improvised desperation. That's engineering. Clothing is where the evidence gets surprisingly precise. For a long time, researchers assumed ancient humans wore rough animal skins draped loosely over their bodies. Then they started finding needles. Bone and ivory needles with actual eyes, a hole for threading sinew or plant fiber, start appearing in the archaeological record around 50,000 years ago in some regions and become common by 30,000 years ago. An eyed needle means tailored clothing. It means seams. It means garments fitted closely enough to trap body heat rather than letting it escape at the neck and wrists. Some researchers have even used lice genetics to estimate when humans started wearing clothes regularly, and those estimates cluster around 170,000 years ago, suggesting clothing predates the coldest periods by a wide M. Origin. The caloric side of winter survival doesn't get talked about enough. In extreme cold, your body burns significantly more energy just maintaining its core temperature. Ancient humans in glacial Europe would have needed far more calories per day than the average modern person consumes, and they had to pull those calories from the landscape around them. That meant large animals. Woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, bison, reindeer. These megafauna were the caloric backbone of cold climate survival. A single mammoth could provide hundreds of kilograms of meat, fat, and bone marrow, along with hides for clothing and bones for construction. Fat was especially valuable. Lean meat alone isn't enough when it's that cold, and hunter-gatherers understood this clearly. Evidence from Paleolithic butchery sites shows deliberate targeting of the fattiest parts of an animal. The marrow-rich bones, the organs, the thick subcutaneous layers just under the hide. Storage mattered just as much as the hunt itself. In permafrost regions, the frozen ground worked as a natural freezer. There's evidence from Siberian sites that ancient humans cached meat underground, below the frost line, and returned to it weeks or months later. In areas without permafrost, drying and smoking were the primary options. Dried meat is lightweight, calorie-dense, and lasts for months without spoiling. Some researchers think the period right before winter was as critical as winter itself, a concentrated effort to accumulate enough stored food to carry a group through the months when hunting would be harder, plant foods would be gone, and every journey outside would cost energy the body couldn't easily replace. Let's talk about what those social structures actually looked like, because they weren't informal. At a site in Russia called Sunhir, archaeologists found burials dating to around 34,000 years ago. 2 children buried head-to-head, covered in thousands of mammoth ivory beads that would have taken an estimated 10,000 hours of labor to produce. Fox teeth, carved pendants, mammoth ivory spears straightened through heat treatment. The volume of work in those graves tells you something important about how these communities functioned. They had specialization. Some people made things while others hunted. They had surplus because you don't spend 10,000 hours on grave goods if survival is consuming every waking hour. And they had the kind of social bonds that made people invest enormous effort in marking the deaths of their own. Those bonds stretched across geography in ways we're still working out. Shells from Mediterranean coasts have been found at inland sites hundreds of kilometers away. Specific types of flint were carried or traded across enormous distances. When one group found a better method for insulating a shelter, or a more efficient way to preserve meat through the coldest months, that knowledge could travel. It didn't have to be reinvented independently by every group that encountered the same problem. The communities that made it through winter weren't isolated units doing everything on their own. They were nodes in a wider system, and the wider that system reached, the more resilient any single group within it became. There's also a biological dimension to this that's easy to overlook. Human populations that spent thousands of years in cold environments didn't just adapt culturally, they adapted physically. Modern Siberian and Arctic populations carry genetic variants that affect how the body generates heat from fat tissue, a process called non-shivering thermogenesis. It's more efficient than shivering and matters enormously when you're exposed to cold for hours at a stretch. These variants are far more common in populations with deep roots in cold climates. The cold didn't just select for smarter behavior, it selected for bodies that handled the cold differently at a metabolic level. Neanderthals had worked through some of this long before modern humans arrived in Europe. Their build was almost purpose-designed for cold retention. Short, stocky limbs reduced the surface area through which heat escapes. Wide nasal passages warmed and humidified freezing air before it reached the lungs. Higher muscle mass generated more body heat passively. They had been living through European ice ages for hundreds of thousands of years, and the cold that might push a modern human to the edge of survival was, for a Neanderthal, something closer to ordinary life. Their campsites show repeated fire use, carefully selected shelter locations, and evidence of planning their movements around seasonal animal migrations rather than simply reacting to whatever they encountered. What's striking about all of this is how layered the solutions were. No single adaptation was enough on its own. Fire without shelter still leaves you exposed. Shelter without stored food means starvation by February. Good clothing without knowing where the herds are moving means you can stay warm while you slowly starve in one place. Every piece of the winter survival system depended on the others, which means it couldn't have come together all at once. It built up incrementally, each generation passing on what worked and letting go of what didn't. The knowledge compounding over tens of thousands of years into something that could actually hold against the worst winters the planet produced. One site captures the full picture better than almost any other. Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic dates to around 26,000 years ago, right in the middle of the coldest stretch of the last glacial maximum. Researchers found semi-permanent structures, hearths, food storage pits, and something completely unexpected, a kiln. People were firing clay figurines at temperatures above 500 degrees Celsius. The Venus of Dolní Věstonice, a small ceramic figurine, came out of that site. In the middle of a brutal Ice Age winter, with survival genuinely on the line, people were making art, in a purpose-built structure, with enough technical knowledge to control a high-temperature kiln. That's not what a population looks like when it's just barely holding on. Survival in those winters wasn't a matter of raw toughness or being the hardiest individual. It was about accumulated knowledge, maintained relationships, and the ability to pass both of those things forward in time. The groups that came through winter intact were the ones who had prepared months in advance, who knew where to find food when the landscape looked empty, and who kept enough people together to share the work. Winter shaped these communities more than almost any other single pressure. The communities visible in the archaeological record, the ones who left behind art and tools and carefully attended burials, weren't surviving in spite of winter. In a lot of ways, they were built by it.